RE0's 64th episode is called Theresia van Astrea, and it's the third character name to serve as a title this season, bringing the total count up to 6. It, too, follows the pattern of revealing some part of the named character's backstory that only the audience is privy to. In Theresia's case, this means her early years with the Sword Saint power, the circumstances of her death, and, curiously, a secret about love at first sight that she never did confess to Wilhelm. That insight is the first and last thing she thinks within the main section of the episode. Both the repetition and the placement at the end are sure indicators of its significance. It is one of the things we will examine today as we build our more complete understanding of the family history. But there are two other parts of the episode that are likewise positioned in a conspicuous final spot: Theresia's thoughts at the end of her life, and the actual after-credits scene that finishes the episode. These both concern Reinhard, who wears the sword and title in her place. We are thus invited to compare the two scenes, as well as the two Sword Saints. And of particular interest in that examination is the accusation leveled at Reinhard in both past and present, that he killed Theresia. While today's video is called Reinhard on Trial, I'm not actually going to try him on the matter of being Theresia's murderer, then or now. Instead, there is a different accusation we might level at him, one that made the final 3 minutes of this episode one of the most contentious and debated events in my community for the whole series. Because of the parallels drawn between him and Theresia, we will start by building our picture of her, then examine Wilhelm and Heinkel's part in this, before concluding with the explanation of Reinhard's trial and what it may mean for the future of the story. As an aside, Crunchyroll seems to have finally switched to saying Sword Saint instead of Master Swordsman in the subtitles, and so I will do likewise, but just treat the terms as interchangeable. Now, before we get to the Astrea family saga, I will first continue to answer questions submitted in the comments of past videos. Please do so again for today's video and next week's video, but remember that we are only interested in the anime version of the story. Comments sharing missing details from the light novels or future events are being removed by the generous efforts of volunteers to allow me to remain spoiler-free, but it's upsetting that they have any work to do at all. If you aren't absolutely sure that a detail originates in the anime, then please do not include it. Thank you. I will give 3 answers again today, and we'll combine some questions as I have before. The first comes from Conjuful2963 about the gluttonies, and since I think we'll see them again soon, it's a good time to answer their question. Now that it seems like both Roy and Lai have the power to eat people, Roy for Julius and Lai for Rem, I'm curious if that implies anything to their connection with the 3 great maw beasts. If Lai was the great whale and Roy is either the serpent or the rabbit, why do they both have the power of the whale? I think I would reverse the question and ask why the great rabbit and the black serpent don't have the power to erase people. Or maybe wonder if they do and it simply hasn't come up. And I'm framing it this way because of how Puck explained things at the beginning of Season 2. He told Subaru that gluttony is a power for eating, and then explains about eating memories, eating names, and how Rem's situation is what happens if both are eaten. If that is the true nature of the gluttony witch factor, then it would stand to reason that all of the archbishops of gluttony should possess that capacity, and it may instead be that the great maw beasts are the ones who have partial versions of this eating power. The whale's breath attack appears to mimic the eating of names, but can the whale eat memories? It attacks, well, all of the attacks of the great maw beasts tend to be rather fatal, so I'm not sure we could even learn if they possess that aspect. Perhaps instead, each distinct archbishop has a different power associated with the great maw beast they match. Perhaps Roy as Hydra does match the black serpent and will turn out to have something like its venom, and maybe Lai can summon fog like the whale. Or maybe they simply are able to replicate themselves, as all the great maw beasts have a form of replication. The great rabbit endlessly copies itself as a decentralized swarm, the whale can project 2 copies of itself but with a central main body, and the black serpent's venom can still act on its own when split off. So it may be that all the gluttony archbishops have the eating power and the splitting power, and the great maw beast connection is simply the limit of how many can exist at once. Perhaps they will be like the whale, where one is the main body and therefore the one you have to defeat. Or maybe they'll be like the rabbit, and all 3 have to be defeated at the same time to win the day. I feel like either of those scenarios sets up a situation where characters believe they have defeated the Archbishop of Gluttony, only to learn that it isn't that simple, and that may be all we get out of this season as far as this threat is concerned. Next up are a bunch of questions about vampires, no doubt prompted by how much I mentioned Elsa and Garfield's connection in the last video. I'm going to abbreviate these questions a bit, but first up is Noski Subaru X, asking if I think that Garfield's whole hallucination of Elsa is really just his own imagination, or, in their theory, maybe her being a vampire and Garfield biting her neck and consuming her blood has actually affected him in some way. Maybe she lives on in his blood. Midge is Cool has a similar thought, wondering if Garf's a vampire now. They further point out that in this last episode, Garf seems to be just absolutely eating attacks that they feel should hinder him more. I wondered the same thing in the first half of the season, and I included it in one of the videos that I made back then, noting that every other instance of characters seeing something that wasn't really there ended up being the result of someone's magic. Whether that's Pandora messing with Fortuna, or Rom catching Subaru and company with a hallucination on the road, or whatever is going on whenever Subaru sees Satila's presence draw near. The series to that point never created vivid hallucinations to illustrate someone's mental state or memory. So if Elsa was simply a nagging regret given form, it seemed to break that mold. Since then, though, we've had the example of Amelia visualizing juice when she's touched by the unseen hand, and in this episode, Theresia sees her deceased uncle and a representation of a crossroads moment as visions, so the situation with Elsa is no longer unique. Luckily, we will probably get an answer rather soon. Garfield has one a broken arm and another with severed tendons, so if he is back in action without a healer's help, then we'll know he has a healing factor as well. My instinct, though, is that he's not, because his last words to the Elsa vision struck me as having a note of finality to them. She is a manifestation of his uncertainty, but he has faced that now with Kurgan's accidental assistance, so I suspect that this is the last we see of her. She basically gave us a physical form to represent his inner turmoil, an enemy to be defeated instead of some nebulous abstraction. Now for a bonus vampire question from Vinicius Duran in 1922. Do you have an idea on who among the witches is the vampire Garfield is referring to? Is there anything on their behavior, or their names, or mythology behind them that can give us any clue? Basically, we know one of the witches was a vampire because Garfield brings it up in the fight with Elsa, though he does not specify who, and perhaps does not know. Our limited information on the witches makes it impossible to be certain, but Carmela, the Witch of Lust, is probably the smart money. If that is her intended name, then she breaks the pattern of the mythological origins that all of the non-Satella witches otherwise share. Instead, Carmela is the name of a literary vampire found in the novella of the same name by Sheraton Le Fanu, published some 25 years before Bram Stoker's more famous Dracula. These two Irish authors knew one another, and both created vampire stories in which seduction and sexuality were prominent themes, and are likely responsible for the persistent presence of these ideas in vampire fiction to this day. That seems rather appropriate for a Witch of Lust just on principle, but Carmela's authority that enables her, and now Coppola, to appear as someone the other person loves or desires could be likened to the vampire trope of a glamour or hypnotic seduction, which kind of reinforces the link. Of course, that might be so on the nose that it'll turn out to be someone else, but I do want to point out that Carmela's scarf makes her the only witch whose neck is completely covered. The example of Garf defeating Elsa suggested to me that the neck is the weak point for this world's vampires, and so maybe that explains her choice of apparel. Lastly, because it's relevant to what I will say in this video, I'm reaching back to the first and second videos after I asked for questions. NexiLol asked me several things, but the series' specific one at the end is, what do you think about Amelia's third trial? Have you tried to predict some later events with the info from there, or is there too little to work with so far? And the next week, Nightmare I4431 likewise asked for my thoughts on Amelia's third trial from Season 2, and have the events from Season 3 changed any of them? To remind everyone, they were referring to the final trial Amelia went through where she is shown visions of possible futures. And I say possible because of what Minerva tells Amelia afterwards. She even suggests that Echidna showed unpleasant possibilities as a form of bullying. There's only one we get to see ourselves, Emilia in the burned-out husk of Laguna's throne room as she thinks about someone she's hated from the very first day she met them. The only person we know of who might fit that bill right now is Pandora, and certainly her showing up in this episode makes that even more likely, as far as I'm concerned. But the actual event portrayed seems way too far out to connect to anything we know right now. However, she then witnessed a succession of other futures, and while we only see these as colorful stars flying past her, we are able to hear various lines of dialogue from characters that presumably are saying them on some distant day. When this episode released, we set about trying to match lines with voices, and recently revisited that scene as well. I feel like we have most of them sorted, with lines belonging to every knight and candidate pair, plus Wilhelm and Romji, and every member of Emilia's team except for Betty. So, of these, which may have been changed by the events in Season 3? We can ignore the lines from those who aren't in the city, which eliminates a third of them. Some refer to events that don't seem to have yet come up, such as Phyllis yelling, "Why won't the soul take hold?" and Garfield angrily declaring he's going to kill Subaru like he promised. Others feature characters in states of emotion we haven't seen yet either, such as Anastasia crying as she says, "What's so hard about saying I don't want to be alone?" and Al emotionally distraught as he apologizes to someone for not being able to kill them. Then there's things like Priscilla saying, "There, you see, I win again," which I feel like she could utter at any given moment, so that's not much of a peek into the future at all. From what remains, at the beginning of the season, Wilhelm's line seemed like it might be relevant. His shouted question goes, "You cannot even wield the sword without it, thief?" That made me think of the sword Reinhard carries that has such particular restrictions, as well as the Sword Saint's divine protection that confers sword skills in the first place. Plus there's the fact that the two of them are not on good terms thanks to Wilhelm's past accusation. Now that we've caught up to the moment that Reinhard finally draws Chekhov's sword, I'm guessing instead that this must be something further in the future, and the missed opportunity to repair their relationship keeps that possibility in play. Cruz's line also seems pretty relevant, as she says, "Under no circumstances shall I be killed by something as nonsensical as a curse." She is currently infected by Coppola's cursed dragon blood, and perhaps without Subaru taking part of it into himself, she was doomed to die. But she's also not yet cured, and they have no other leads, so maybe she's not out of the water yet. Entirely possible that she has yet to receive the referenced curse too, that the memory loss and dragon blood are not even the end of her misfortune, but this seems the most likely out of all of them to potentially have been averted by Season 3's events. Now, two others are kind of maybes, because those characters are in conflicts that the season is yet to resolve. The first is Otto, who says, "If that's the case, I should have just been wrapped up in that cave and left for dead." This references when he was a captive of Betelgeuse and the cult, and sounds like a regret that he was ever rescued. Subaru is the one who cleared his name and so began to earn his loyalty, so Otto's line in reference to something concerning Subaru would be my first guess. We've wondered if Roswell's restored Tome of Wisdom might have information about Subaru being able to return by death, and Otto learning of Subaru's nightmarish journey could possibly prompt a line like this, I think. The other is Julius's line, which goes, "If I bend my knee and lose my sword, what is left for me?" While I can't quite imagine the scenario in which this is said, Subaru's conversation with him in the premiere about not obsessing over being the perfect, courteous knight all the time at least seems like it was introducing a future crisis for Julius, where he chooses between his knighthood and something else that he values. Maybe this won't come up in the 2 remaining episodes, but it does seem like a near-future possibility. So perhaps whatever involves Julius and the rest of the season will provide us with some clarity. Finally, the very first line in the succession of stars is extremely relevant to where we are right now. But to address that, we must return to talking about episode 64, Theresia's backstory and the entire Astrea family situation. Theresia's backstory fills in our understanding in 2 main ways. The first is giving us a second example of someone inheriting the Sword Saint power and how it affected them, a point of comparison and contrast with Reinhard. The second is providing Theresia's perspective on the romance between her and Wilhelm, rounding out what we are able to extract from Wilhelm's own comments and flashbacks from Season 1. We will start with this latter point, a more complete picture of the sword demon's love song. Unlike most of the other backstory examples, the Wilhelm van Astrea episode in the first season does not present a flashback as an uninterrupted sequence, but is instead teased out in short scenes intercut with the fight against the white whale. Also, unlike the other examples, it does not conclude in that episode, but in the next, when Wilhelm is given the honor to deliver the coup de grace. As such, a little work is required to extract his version of events, so this is my understanding in summary. He meets Theresia at a spot where he likes to practice his swordsmanship, is surprised to find a woman out there so early and says as much, and she invites him to look at the flowers. Time passes, and he returns to the spot repeatedly to practice, and she returns repeatedly as well, maybe for the flowers, maybe for the company. She asks him why he wields the sword, and she congratulates him when he is conferred as a knight. That conferment means he fights in the ongoing demi-human war, where he is rescued from death by a familiar red-haired woman. Now understanding who she is, Wilhelm is embarrassed. The sword saint herself watching him practice swings morning after morning, and him speaking loftily of wielding the sword to protect, only to need protection himself. For all that he plays the stoic, Wilhelm is an emotional guy, and attacks her in this upset state. She handles him easily and declares that she won't come there anymore. There is a note of sadness or perhaps disappointment in her face, but otherwise her emotional response is quite flat compared to his own. Thus Wilhelm calls after her. Someone with a face like that shouldn't wield a sword. In response, she says she didn't understand the reason why she was the sword saint before, but she does now, citing his own rationale of wanting to protect. The implication is that she had little reason to do so before. And in fact, before the battle that triggers the flashbacks, we had the present-day Wilhelm explain that she never wished to wield a sword, but the sword loved her more than anyone. Wilhelm's parting words to her in that exchange, and what happens in the time skip afterwards, are where the love story element comes in. He realizes she doesn't love the sword, doesn't want to do any of it, and declares that he will take her sword from her. The next time they meet is sometime later, Theresia being lauded or rewarded or something in the Lagunica throne room. Wilhelm chooses this moment to challenge her, in front of the knights and wise men and royals, a most auspicious and strategically chosen audience. And here's the key. When Wilhelm trained to wield the sword for some abstract notion of protecting or becoming a knight to do so, he only took his aptitude just so far. Defeated on the battlefield, easily disarmed by her. But once training out of a love for Theresia, out of a desire to free her from the sword-wielding fate that she does not want, with that motivation, he becomes the greatest swordsman in the land. I have to imagine that there are very few examples of the sword saint not being the kingdom's greatest warrior. And to keep Theresia from needing to pick the sword back up, he must continue that excellence, must always work to be better than the overpowered talents that the inherited divine protection provides. A lifelong effort proving his love. But alas, for all that, he cannot seem to actually say the words to her. That regret he carries every day after her death. Killing the whale might not be revenge so much as a reprieve, for at the moment it is defeated, Wilhelm finally shouts out that he loves her. I believe one of the reasons Wilhelm is so loyal and grateful to Subaru is not because of arranging the chance to slay the beast, but because of what he says afterwards. That he believes Wilhelm was able to do this because he loved his wife like crazy. He validates the love Wilhelm is worried he did not properly express, and his gratitude is palpable. Returning to Theresia's version of events, we also begin with that first meeting, but with the added detail that she loved him at first sight. Wilhelm did not earn her love so much as learn to accept it and return it, and she, too, had something she never could bring herself to say. Or maybe she was saving it for when he finally put his love into words. The question her story must answer, then, is why she would react that way. To me, it appears rooted in her experience as a young and reluctant sword saint, with perhaps a bit of good timing. The power passed to her from her uncle when she was 12 years old, favoring her despite her gentle nature, and an older brother who already loved the sword and was dedicated to its practice. Called to campaign just 2 years later, she cannot bring herself to join the battlefield, to wield the sword at all. The older brother, spurned by the power, offers her comfort. He demonstrates his authenticity by first admitting his frustration, but then reiterating his love of the sword and gratitude for his family, for having little brothers and a little sister like her. He offers to relieve her burden, to take her sword from her in a sense, leading the vanguard so that she will not have to. For her part, she loved him for his dedication and effort, that not a day went by that he didn't train with his sword. I also think his statement referring to her just as his sister and wanting to protect her as the big brother factors into this love as well. He treats her as his younger sibling first and as the sword saint second. I think just in that, we can draw parallels between him and Wilhelm. His offer to take her sword from her comes later, but from the same place as her brother, an act of love to spare her a fate she does not want. When they first meet, Wilhelm doesn't see her as the sword saint, doesn't even know that she is. She's just a woman who is there early in the morning. And he, like the brother, practices diligently. He puts in the effort. It's something she admires. For however many mornings this lasts, she gets to return to being the girl who just watched men around her practice at swords while she enjoys the company of flowers. And I think it came at just the right time. Returning now to her first campaign, we can conjecture that her decision not to join the battlefield weakens their side. The brother who takes her place dies, and other family follow, including the uncle who was the previous bearer. If he still held the power at this point, who knows how many of her family would have died at all, or if the war would have lasted as long as it did. Theresia has not lifted a sword against anyone, and yet may feel responsible for death all the same. There are two scenes that mirror each other, and I think encapsulate her dilemma, a choice presented to her at two different points. One is after the power transfers, and she's demonstrated it by besting her brother, after which the uncle offers her the sword. The framing puts her between brother and uncle, in the middle of two choices, picking up the sword to follow her uncle's example on the battlefield, or the other direction in which her brother covers for her. And this choice is in the setting of a literal flower garden. It's the path she wants to take, the path of flowers. But because she does so, when the choice comes again, the garden is replaced by a battlefield. Again, she is between her uncle and brother, and though she still turns from her uncle, this time she runs into her brother's corpse. This way is no longer open. Here, the ground does not sprout blooms, but blades. Her only choice now is the path of swords, to pick hers up and so assume the responsibility. It's the ensuing imagery that makes me believe there is a matter of timing to meeting Wilhelm. When Theresia relents and goes to lift up her sword, we see two flowers at the base of the blade begin to burn away, joining all the other drifting ash and embers in the war-torn air. It's as though fully surrendering to the sword will leave the Theresia who love flowers far behind, that the path closes forever. Instead, a flower field spreads out, the floating embers replaced by petals, to accompany Wilhelm asking her what a woman is doing out here first thing in the morning. I take this to mean that she met him around the same time she finally decided she must pick up the sword after all, that the only reason the flowers returned was their chance meeting. The demi-human war appears to have gone on a while, consisting of multiple campaigns, and so between the one in which she didn't fight and the one in which she did, she meets Wilhelm, who reminds her of her lost loved ones and treats her as any other girl. I think this grounds her and reverses what seems like a troubling element to this whole sword saint thing, a new insight that we may have to consider as it may relate to Reinhard. Backing up again to the sparring match between Theresia and her brother after she gains the power, she handles him with ease, but does so almost as if in a trance, as she is shocked to realize what she's done. I think this suggests that this may not be an ability a user wields, but an ability that wields its user. Theresia with sword in hand cannot help but be a superlative and a dead serious fighter. A later scene has the ghost image of her uncle refer to this event, and how her brother must have looked so full of openings, telling us that the power confers perceptual abilities on top of martial ones, that there is a totality to the blessing it invests in its possessor. And of course there's the uncle himself, with his robotic insistence that she pick up the sword, as though in something of a trance himself, or else as one whose identity has been pared down to just the sword saint. The moment when Theresia finally echoes his repeated line to pick up the sword, she also appears like she is surrendering her will, and maybe she too would have become someone for whom the title and identity are one. But she meets Wilhelm before that happens, and she takes up his reason for wielding it instead. And perhaps carrying the purpose of one she loves makes a difference in how the power affects her. Let us consider the possibility, then, that Reinhard could be affected in a similar manner to what this backstory appears to portray happened, or almost happened, to Theresia. Aside from that, Theresia's example demonstrates that the Sword Saint power passing to another while the current one lives is not some kind of anomaly, as it's how she received it herself. Passing from uncle to niece suggests it doesn't strictly follow direct bloodline, and skipping her brothers means it is not choosing the most obviously qualified or prepared person as its new vessel. And all that tells us that Reinhard inheriting the power as a young child from his still-living grandmother as it skips his father is not as unusual as an event as it first appeared, or at least it should not have seemed so to everyone else. We get to see the surrounding circumstances that are in fact quite unusual, but we will come back to that. Receiving the power from a living relative while still a child is not all that Reinhard and Theresia have in common. Both experienced immediate misfortune upon being so blessed. Theresia because she doesn't want to hurt a fly and destroyed her brother's dream, and Reinhard because of being blamed for her death. Each also lost family and were somewhat isolated in the early years of possessing the power, Theresia due to the war, and Reinhard due to her death and the blame. Our montage of Theresia's life is quite abbreviated, but it's possible that this scene is meant to imply that Heinkel's wife, Reinhard's mother, died when he was quite young. Theresia does mention that they went through many things alongside these images, and perhaps such a death is what she means. At the very least, there's been no reference to her by any of the family we've met, and so that may also suggest such a fate. If so, then Reinhard may have been even more isolated than Theresia, losing her and Wilhelm at the same time, and having only the hapless Heinkel to look out for him. Perhaps Theresia anticipates a hard road ahead for him. She seems to know the power went to Reinhard as soon as it's gone, just as her uncle seemed to know it had passed to her. And so, in some of her last thoughts, she is dwelling on her young grandson, and praying that, like her, he will have encounters in his life with more than just the sword. Her story strongly suggests that it was the good fortune of meeting Wilhelm when she did that enabled that happy life. If we are to continue that parallel, then Reinhard might also need to meet the right person or persons to hope for a life apart from the role he's inherited. It doesn't have to be someone who takes his sword from him necessarily, but perhaps someone who treats him as a person first and the Sword Saint second, or someone more invested in his well-being than in his results. We'll return to this in the last section. Finally, we need to talk about the unusual circumstances of Theresia's death. The white whale has shown up in a situation where the kingdom believes it's worth trying to hunt it down. But before that conquest could get underway, a royal princess was kidnapped. Naming the victim as a princess now, instead of just the general member of the royal family that Julius told us about, I think moves the chance of it being felt from 90% to 99%, so let's just make a note of that. The two simultaneous crises mean that Wilhelm cannot do both, and Heinkel suggested Theresia join this whale hunt. It's clear Wilhelm already has a low opinion of his son before this point, though she seems to chastise him, or perhaps the both of them, for it. She is determined to accept the task. It's unclear to me if Heinkel would have been the one who went if she didn't, but if that is the case, then it would be like Theresia mirroring what her older brother once did for her, and unfortunately in more ways than one. To prevent Wilhelm from following her, she creates a wound in his shoulder, activating her divine protection of the death god. Since this is meant to keep him away, I think this must mean that the effect only persists within a certain distance. If she travels far afield on the hunt, Wilhelm's wound will heal in the meantime. If he follows, it will not, and he will die. I'm guessing that her premature death must have frozen that wound where it was, and her return as a corpse soldier is why it bleeds again. There is a scene earlier in the season when Garfield first mentions the female cultist, and Wilhelm grips the same offending shoulder in response. They again have the exchange about whether he loves her and his inability to say so. In an ominous bit of foreshadowing, she asks that when she comes back, he let her hear the words he wouldn't say back then, which does eventually happen, but not in the way either of them intended. For this to be how they parted makes plain why Wilhelm was so distressed over never speaking up, why he avoided her grave, and why he shouted his love at the end of the whale hunt. On her actual hunt, we meet a familiar face, this guy, who would later return to aid Wilhelm on the successful conquest. That at least tells us there were survivors to this disaster, but apparently no witnesses to Theresia's last moments. The power leaves her before she can draw the sword against the whale, and in the ensuing chaos, she is alone with Pandora. Though it's a sample size of 2, we should note that Pandora's appearances have accompanied great maw beasts both times, the Black Serpent in Amelia's childhood, and the whale in this instance. Pandora also leaves no witnesses in either encounter, though Amelia does get her memories back eventually, so perhaps the great maw beasts are something of a smokescreen. Whether it's some kind of warrior instinct, recognition, or just realizing the weirdness of this all-white girl alone and unperturbed in this forest, Theresia knows she is an enemy and charges her with a borrowed sword. Unfortunately, we know that death doesn't stick to Pandora very easily, divine protection of the death god or not. Pandora gets in her ear to whisper that she wants to understand her, and we cut to Theresia crashing lifelessly to the ground, her final thought of Wilhelm. Now, while it was established that the Sword Saint power does move to a new person while both are still living, and apparently at its own discretion, the timing of this is still rather suspect. Passing to her from her uncle while both are peacefully at home is one thing, but fleeing right as she is charging into battle and preparing to draw her blade? If that was normal, then no Sword Saint should have any faith in the power. They should go into every battle with a nagging doubt as to whether they will be abandoned when they need it most. That would erode the effectiveness of the blessing in the first place, introducing hesitation into the warriors. This may be part of why Wilhelm resorts to blaming Reinhard, recognizing the dissonance of choosing that moment to transfer hosts. If Reinhard's ability to basically download divine protections is something particular to him, then maybe all the more reason to think he caused the event, whether he intended to or not. For us, though, Pandora's presence is too much of a coincidence to have nothing to do with how this plays out. The timing of the kidnapping that forces Theresia to take up the sword is also suspicious, and I'm inclined to believe this encounter was its true purpose. While I don't know if Pandora's powers would enable her to influence the divine protection to leave prematurely, it may be that Theresia was her target, and she hopes to gain influence over a sword saint towards some end. She does get right in her ear to whisper to her, and we already saw how that worked out in Ajusa's case. So perhaps instead the sword saint power fled Theresia to avoid that outcome. Once she is no longer the target she wanted, Pandora kills her instead, and none are the wiser. Or maybe causing the power to transfer one way or another was Pandora's intent all along, and her actual target was Reinhard. After all, everything that goes poorly for him, the accusation, the ensuing isolation, it's all down to the timing of it. If he'd inherited the power the day before or the day after, then Theresia probably doesn't die, and no one accuses him of having killed her. It's only the precise situation of her riding against the white whale instead of Wilhelm, and the precise timing of the power transferring that sets Reinhard on this trajectory. And not just him, mind, as Wilhelm and Heinkel seem to have had a hard time of it themselves. So, let us now look at the two of them in brief. While Wilhelm accusing his young grandson of killing his wife is obviously not his finest moment, I sympathize with his state of mind. It was the work of his lifetime to maintain his position as a stronger swordsman so that Theresia could live the life she wanted rather than the one chosen for her. To have her then die in what might be the first time she had to take the sword back up is a bitter pill, made all the worse for the parting question he was supposed to answer upon her return. Though we still don't know the outcome of the kidnapped princess situation, if it really is felt, then that means he failed in the quest that took him away from the whale hunt in the first place, and wow, that is a lot of things going wrong. This season, then, sets up opportunities for him to mend some of these scars. He and Reinhard are drawn together due to Anastasia's invitation, and the white whale is a year dead behind them. Wilhelm wants to make amends and seems like he might get a chance. And while Theresia is not exactly back, there's a window there as well. Wilhelm was our resident expert on corpse soldiers, and it may be that he knew they experienced moments of lucidity between receiving a fatal blow and collapsing in dust. His dialogue with Theresia near the beginning of the episode at least suggests that to me. He references the promise he is supposed to fulfill alongside a flashback of her saying, "When I come back." Later in the full scene, we hear her continuation, "Let me hear the words you wouldn't say back then." And that is the promise he is supposed to fulfill. And after proclaiming as much, he does not tell the corpse soldier he loves her, but presses the attack, presumably looking for that fatal wound so he can confess to a lucid version of his late wife. For all that, though, he really seems of two minds about the situation. In the previous episode Stinger, he talked about having plenty of time with his wife when he joined her on the other side, that this was no dream but reality. To me, that sounds like he's trying to talk himself out of prolonging their fight, out of enjoying crossing blades with her once more. Continuing into this episode then, he begins talking about how one can have doubts before picking up the sword, but never once it is in hand. Since he has drawn his sword against her, he should have no more doubts, but just him saying as much might mean that he does. And then Heinkel bungles into the fight, and the momentary distraction is all that's necessary for Theresia to turn the tables. It falls to newly arrived Reinhard to face her instead, and here Wilhelm tries to stop him. "Please don't kill her. That's my Theresia." Does he not actually want to see her dealt a fatal blow, despite all he said? Or does he want it to be by his hand as her husband? Or most of all, does he want to prevent Reinhard from being the one to do the deed, regretting the accusation he made in the past and not wanting there to be even this much truth to it? It's all rather ambiguous, and I could fully believe he doesn't quite know himself. Heinkel, too, doesn't seem to know what to think. At first he's in denial that this could be Theresia, which is understandable, but he adds that even if she is, there's no way his dad would lose. Once he's disarmed, though, he believes it's her well enough, addressing her as his mother as he begs for his life. After Reinhard saves him, he continues to try to make sense of things, but curiously asks what he did wrong, as though he suspects the event playing out before him is his own fault. Skipping to the post-credits scene, we can observe a continuation of this mindset. Heinkel argues against Reinhard's statement that couldn't have been his grandmother by asking what that last part was about, when she was glaring reproachfully at the two of them. She was in fact doing it no such thing. It was a loving gaze accompanying loving thoughts, but that was how Heinkel interpreted it all the same. It's what he expected to see, and so he did. In that, I think we can assume that he has carried a massive burden of guilt all this time. It was his idea that she join the whale hunt, after all, and perhaps he expected to receive the blame when Wilhelm returned. It went to Reinhard instead, but this does not absolve Heinkel in his own mind. He assumes she glares at both of them because both of them are to blame. The whole reason he so viciously accuses Reinhard of murder in this scene is to keep that guilt focused on his son instead of himself, going on the attack so that he won't be the one on defense. It seems Heinkel really loved his mother and was devastated by her loss, but feeling responsibility for it has really eaten away at him and his ability to connect to his father and his son. His annoyed reaction to Subaru mistakenly calling him Van Astrea back in the premiere makes a lot more sense now. Heinkel is full of self-loathing, and has created rifts between himself and these other family members on purpose. For both Heinkel and Wilhelm, then, Theresia's last moments as a defeated corpse soldier, but somehow also the woman they knew, are very emotional and very confusing. Upon hearing her voice, Heinkel can only bury his face in his hands, while Wilhelm tries to keep it together long enough to fulfill his promise. His distress is plain as he talks about how his silence made her suffer, made her worry for over 20 years while he failed to put his thoughts into words. For him, at least, there is healing in all this. She assuages his guilt by assuring him that he in fact had been saying it all this time, that she was never worried or in doubt of his love. It's just that he said it with his eyes, his voice, his bearing, and his actions. To me, this is an interesting parallel to Coppola's description of how she built Priscilla from Al's gestures and reactions and bearings. Both assert that someone's affections for another can be read off of their body language. It's a vulnerability to be exploited in Coppola's case, but a wholesome conclusion to a long love story in Theresia's. And even though Wilhelm really didn't need to say the words, he manages to cross that regret off his list all the same, as she affirms that she knew it all along. Whatever it is the corpse soldiers are, It's hard to believe that this wasn't Theresia in at least some form. Certainly, for Wilhelm to feel as though he has fulfilled his promise, he must put some faith in that idea, regardless of his earlier words. I'm unsure where his head's at, but the way he methodically gathers the dust of her remains into the folded robe and cradles it to himself tells me where his heart is. All in all, this was a confused, messy encounter, and perhaps trying to make sense of it is futile. The ambiguity for the characters as to what really happened is probably intentional. Heinkel goes through shock, fear, guilt, anger, and uncertainty, while Wilhelm makes an anguished confession, bears the most vulnerable part of his heart, and now grieves for his wife anew. All present are dazed from the emotional onslaught, and the wounds in their heart ache anew. All present, save one. One person has no confusion and shows no emotion. And for that, I propose we put him on trial. Let us quickly run through the facts of the case. The accused joined the fight and prevented his father's death. When faced with Theresia, he flatly declared that the dead do not move, the dead have no future, he will not allow such absurdity. In response to his grandfather's plea not to kill her, he answers that his grandmother died 15 years ago by his hand. This one is a mere fake. When Theresia and Wilhelm exchange their last words, Reinhard is paying close attention, but says nothing and betrays no emotion. When Heinkel accuses him of having killed the former sword saint in truth now, Reinhard treats all his words as nonsense, finally declaring that it cannot have been the previous sword saint, his grandmother. He moves to support his grandfather, but stands down when asked. And at the last, when Wilhelm asks if he regrets killing her, he answers that he did what was right. He would never regret that. In response to this answer, Wilhelm will tell him he is right. Wilhelm himself is wrong, and so he has nothing else to say to him. He addresses Reinhard with his full title and alludes to the other battles taking place. Reinhard takes his meaning and leaves without comment. Members of the jury, I submit that how you first interpret the motive behind these actions largely derives from your opinion of the accused. If Reinhard to you is the friendly do-gooder that just happens to have overwhelming strength, then perhaps you see his actions as charity, taking the blame on himself once more and refusing to indulge his forebears in renewing their grief. If Reinhard is someone you see as the consummate knight, putting aside all else when duty calls, then perhaps you see a man emotionally distancing himself to better perform the task at hand. And if you see Reinhard as someone socially and emotionally undeveloped, unable or perhaps unwilling to understand others, then you simply saw more evidence of the same. I have mentioned the ambiguity of the corpse soldier situation, as well as the ambiguity in what Wilhelm seems to want. For us in the jury of the audience, there is also ambiguity in the purpose behind Reinhard's actions, now and in the past. We have little insight into him truly, as we never entered his thoughts, and we've never seen him in an unguarded moment. And perhaps that was a deliberate omission leading up to this encounter. We have conjectures about his motives, but little in the way of proof. As I see it, there are three broad possibilities. First is that Reinhard is an empathetic person, and where possible, he acts in the best interest of others as he understands them. Second is that Reinhard is compelled, either by duty or the Sword Saint power, to act in a proper knightly way in all encounters, and what he does or doesn't feel never factors into decisions. And third is that Reinhard has little to no capacity for empathy, or little to no practice with it, and so acts without knowing how other people will feel and without seeing things from their perspective. The key word in all this is empathy, and unfortunately, it has a somewhat ambiguous definition of its own. It's often subdivided, with debates over where the line should go or how many should be drawn, and is often confused with similar concepts like sympathy and compassion. To simplify, for our purposes, there are two forms of empathy that are widely agreed to exist, and those will be the definitions I use. One is emotional empathy, the ability to respond to another's mental state with an appropriate emotion. The other is cognitive empathy, the ability to understand another's perspective. The two are independent of one another, and in fact arise in different parts of the brain, but you can probably see how they frequently work together to shape someone's action or reaction. Now, because showing empathy towards another person is regarded as a positive and pro-social trait, we are tempted to think of empathy itself as positive and its absence as a negative, but this isn't strictly true. Someone can be kind to others with no understanding of their emotions or worldview, and someone can grasp those very clearly, yet still decide to do others harm. So if we are to build a case that Reinhard falls into the first possibility, that he possesses and practices empathy, we need examples of him responding with appropriate emotions and/or demonstrating an understanding of another's point of view. It is entirely possible that Reinhard's stoic and detached manner in this episode was meant as a kindness. He pretends to only see Theresia as an animated corpse so that he can carry the guilt of killing her anew, and pretends not to understand the other's grieving state because he doesn't want them to mourn her all over again. They're still on a battlefield and need to act rationally for the moment, and so he serves as example. The problem with all that is it's conjecture. We have no proof that this is what he thinks, and so can't submit any of it as evidence. But we must look beyond this episode. Perhaps a good example comes after the fight with Elsa, as he and Emilia ponder the fate of Romji and Felt. He points out that officially he cannot overlook what they've done, but unfortunately he's off duty today. Perhaps seeing Felt bent with worry over Romji, as well as the desperate state in which they live, moves him. He understands why she would resort to theft and how traumatized she must be over the attack, and thus chooses mercy. While this is possible, it's not anything he says. His stated rationale was that he was off duty. He might actually be such a stickler for the rules that this isn't a joke. Circumstantial evidence, but a strong one. Moving to the royal selection, Reinhard greets Subaru again, and says that when he heard Emilia would be here, he suspected Subaru would be there as well. Point in fact, Subaru was not invited, but was determined to attend, and so Reinhard's statement suggests an understanding of Subaru's perspective. This is good evidence, at least of cognitive empathy. A similar example exists in his introduction when facing the three thugs in the alley. They recognize who he is and the significance of his sword, and as he explains that as a knight he will have to fight back, he slowly reaches for the hilt as if to draw his weapon out. But he must surely know the sword would not be drawn against such foes, and so this is a pantomime that he expected to scare them without anyone needing to fight. Though still circumstantial, I might also point to Wilhelm's attempt at an olive branch when he asks Reinhard to teach him to make the dai sukiyaki. Reinhard is cold at first when addressed, and Wilhelm especially never states what he feels plainly, but when asked, Reinhard shows a look of surprise, thoughtfulness, and then a smile as he agrees. It seems he intuits his grandfather's desire for them to connect, or at least be more cordial, and if so, he will have figured out Wilhelm's feelings and intent on his own. A moment that at least the audience certainly enjoys is when Reinhard explains to Regulus why he cannot draw his sword against him. The timing and word choice gives the impression of a comedic bit, that he knew this would insult and anger Regulus, and so explained this way on purpose. The audience, as well as Subaru, crack up because we know how Regulus will take it. But whether Reinhard did or did not, this is not a situation in which he would say, because that would spoil the joke. Maybe then the hostage negotiation proves an understanding of Regulus, knowing that he would demand something unfair, and so ensuring that he was the one targeted. And that is about all I can submit to try the case for Reinhard possessing empathy of either kind. And even the last thing could instead be the second possibility, that it is primarily his duty or the sword saint power itself which compels a lot of his behavior. Perhaps Reinhard did not understand that Regulus would deal unfairly, and simply saw it as his duty to be the one in harm's way. Going back to the beginning, regardless of why he was going to let Felt get away, once he sees the stone glow in her hand, his responsibility takes over. It doesn't matter what she or even he wants, he is compelled to bring her to the royal selection. Even his first helpful acts of coming to Subaru's and then Felt's aid when they called for help could likewise be simply him fulfilling his role as he sees it. Putting Felt in a dress to meet the expectations of the court is his duty as her knight and supporter, as is urging her to act more like a lady, as is interposing himself between Felt and Priscilla when the latter starts to threaten her, and as is clearing the smoke to stop Romji from absconding with the final candidate. All the instances where Reinhard acts in his official capacity as Felt's supporter, or in his identity as the Sword Saint, are potentially driven by either a personal conviction or a strong compulsion. This at least he does sometimes say, such as when accepting Regulus's proposed one-on-one, or when mentioning that hunting monsters happens to be his specialty when facing Elsa. But in many other instances, we still get no insight into why he makes each choice. One of the only times we see Reinhard indecisive at all is when Heinkel has taken Felt at sword point, attempting to make him remain there instead of joining the wider resistance against the witch's cult. Here is a conflict of duties. He is a knight and so should be out there protecting the citizens, yet his superior is ordering him to remain. He's Felt's supporter and so should not leave her in harm's way, and yet she is ordering him to go. He stays, so we might conjecture he chooses protecting Felt over the other options, but he might instead have just been frozen in place, unable to discern between two choices which both seemed ones he should make. It's Otto's trick with the bug that breaks the stalemate, after which Felt again orders Reinhard to join the others resisting. Again, two duties compete, and this time he does choose protecting Felt, but she is insistent and he eventually relents. This whole exchange, I think, does provide good evidence that regardless of the state of Reinhard's empathy, he will frequently act in the way he believes is appropriate for his position and will take nothing else into consideration. It's as though he moves along a predetermined path, and either cannot or cannot fathom taking a step aside. Even back in the throne room, Felt called this out. He ascribed Felt's decision to join the selection and save Romji to be something greater than a plan, guided by fate, and she asks in retort if he is a slave to fate. So, returning to this latest episode, we might now reason that since Theresia as a corpse soldier is an enemy combatant, his course is rather clear, even simple. It doesn't matter how he feels, or what the others say about her, or how Wilhelm tries to stay his hand. Reinhard is duty-bound to save his father from death, and duty-bound to dispatch the enemy before him. That the sword allows itself to be drawn in this instance perhaps backs this claim. If she really was Theresia, would it be so willing to cut her down? At least insofar as his identity as Sword Saint is concerned, this is the correct path to take, and the weapon would prevent him if it was not. But is that enough to explain his demeanor on either side of drawing it forth? This returns us to the possibility of the Sword Saint power being a kind of compulsion. I pointed out in Theresia's section how she seemed to enter a trance when first using the ability, and also seemed as though surrendering any choice of path when picking up her sword in the battlefield vision. Even repeating her uncle's line seems an unnatural thing to do, as it means referring to herself in third person. Even when we've seen Reinhard act in ways that are merely duty, he is usually chipper, polite and kind even to opponents, and yet none of that is present in him this episode. Is that due to the drawing of the sword, or simply the company of his family? His duty as knight may require him to slay the corpse soldier, but imposes no restrictions on his demeanor before and especially after. If he truly recognized his grandfather's attempt with the Dai Sukiyaki lesson and warmed up because of it, can he fail to recognize his turmoil now? Or fail to give a semblance of kindness to these two so aggrieved? Is this a result of the Sword Saint power, or is all his niceness merely an act, and he doesn't feel the need to keep it up around these two? Now I want to refer back to the question and answer section at the beginning, and the query about Emilia's third trial. There's a line in there that has seemed significant to many people after viewing this episode. It comes from Subaru, and is actually him quoting something he heard in his own trials. He says, "You're a hero is all you can be." And in response, we can hear Reinhard begin to respond with hesitation. The line was also directed at Reinhard in the first instance, one of the unthinkable presents where the world continues after Subaru's death. Puck is preparing to end the world, and Reinhard arrives to stop him, suggesting that if he must resent someone, then please resent him. But Puck replies that he doesn't resent anyone. You are a true hero, and a hero is all you can be. Puck does not resent Reinhard, because Reinhard isn't really making a choice. He's the hero, and the hero must act, not think, not feel, not decide. To say a hero is all he can be is to assert that the role is one of limitation, that he cannot amount to more because he is constrained by what being the hero entails. We normally think of that word as a positive one, someone embodying virtues or performing much-needed tasks, but here, the term is being diminished. It's a way of saying you could be something greater, but have settled for this. To direct that sentiment at Reinhard the Sword Saint, potentially the most powerful living being, is poignant commentary indeed. In truth, Reinhard as someone who can only be the hero, only the Sword Saint compelled by his duty, is someone dangerous to consider an ally. If his notion of what is right or just disagrees with your own, what recourse would you have to try to stay his hand? And this is not merely hypothetical. Subaru has sworn to Satila, enemy of the world, that he is going to save her. Would Reinhard as Sword Saint go along with such a plan, if fulfilling his role is truly what guides him? And how much worse if there really is a compulsion, instead of just a strong conviction? At least with the latter, one could try to appeal to his humanity, to his mercy, to try to get him to see the situation from a different point of view, and so come to a different conclusion for how he should act. But for such an approach to work, Reinhard would need to be capable of seeing things from another's point of view and understanding how they feel. And so, now let us explore the third possibility, that Reinhard possesses little or no capacity to do so. Starting at the end, then, would we say that Reinhard displayed emotional empathy after Theresia's death? That he responded to Heinkel or Wilhelm's mental state with an appropriate emotion? Well, he doesn't respond with an emotion at all, as it happens. He does not echo their confusion or grief, nor does he display sympathy with their obvious distress. It's possible he knows these are appropriate and holds them back, refusing to comfort these two who have made his life so uncomfortable. As they say, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What about cognitive empathy then? Does he understand their perspective? If we take him at his word, then no. He plainly states he does not understand what Heinkel is saying. He even reiterates it when Heinkel continues. When Wilhelm, for his part, asks if he regrets killing Theresia, does he understand why his grandfather would do so? His answer is simplistically straightforward. He did what was right. He would never regret that. To give such a response, asserting that the answer was self-evident, means he does not grasp the emotional complexity of the situation for Wilhelm. Or he grasps it and is defending himself, or he grasps it and is belittling his grandfather for his emotional turbulence. But while Reinhard's ability to empathize may be in question, I don't think we've ever seen him be cruel or hurtful on purpose, and neither have we seen him attempt to defend himself against the accusation that he killed his grandmother. He even states it himself before he kills her. Well, again, if nothing else, Wilhelm's reaction tells us that he doesn't believe Reinhard understands. He simply repeats the answer he receives, that Reinhard was right, and if so, it means Wilhelm was wrong, matching simplicity with simplicity. If it is that straightforward for Reinhard, then no wonder Wilhelm concludes that he has nothing else to say to him. Addressing Reinhard with a title and honorific is inserting a distance between them, or perhaps is acknowledging the distance he now believes exists. Again, though, Reinhard has complicated history with these two, and we may not want to consider these scenes as representative. Are there other examples of Reinhard appearing to not understand another's emotions or perspective? Well, once you start looking, you find quite a few, so we're not even going to look at every instance. His interactions with Felt are a good place to start. At the beginning, it may appear that he was sympathetic to her situation and was willing to let her go, and perhaps his duty is reason enough for him to change his mind when he sees the insignia glowing. But that is not enough to explain why he grasps and pulls her arm in a way that causes her pain. In fact, he seems not to notice that he does so. He poses her questions about herself, but provides no explanation as to why he asks or why he insists she come with him, either ignoring or simply not understanding her confusion and distress. In fact, he uses some kind of magic to simply knock her out, which prompts Emilia to comment that that wasn't very knightly either, turning the earlier joke about him looking the other way into a comment with more sinister undertones. Next time we see them is when she is introduced to the royal selection, and no sooner do they greet one another than Felt aims a kick at his head. Reinhard's response is to say he is surprised and ask what brought on such behavior. He appears oblivious to how Felt must see the situation, taken from her home against her will, forced to wear clothes picked out for her, and paraded into a room full of strangers. She shouts that he never gave any explanation for dragging her here, indicating Reinhard never considered she might not understand. In fact, when trying to figure out why she's so upset, the first thing he actually asks about is the dress and whether it suits her taste. Such cluelessness seemed like a comedic bit to me at the time, setting them up in an odd couple dynamic. But now, it's another bit of evidence that Reinhard exhibits a consistent pattern. Even at the start of the season, after he and Felt have been together for a year, he is still surprised when she eschewed the clothes he picked out for her and went to buy her own. The issue is not that Reinhard tries to urge her to dress in a way more appropriate to her station. It's that he cannot fathom why she chooses not to do so, and doesn't seem to expect it when she wears something else. On the other hand, Felt seems to have gotten his measure in that same year. When they are discussing the incident with Garfield, Reinhard will explain it was a little misunderstanding, before pivoting to praise Garf for the talent he shows at his age. But she replies that his condescension with a total lack of self-awareness isn't convincing at all. To rephrase, Felt is accusing him of being disingenuous. Reinhard bestows compliments and pleasantries, is polite and humble and inclusive, and Felt seems to believe that it's all an act. In fact, in tone-deaf fashion, he immediately follows up her judgment by saying the yukata suits her, prompting her to stick out her tongue in disgust. If we go back to that incident with Garfield, we can witness the kind of things she seems to mean. After learning Garf's name, Reinhard reveals he knows him as Emilia's shield and offers Garf his hand. When Garf doesn't take it, Reinhard awkwardly retracts and apologizes for possibly offending him, saying he'll be more careful. I think Reinhard understands the motions of nice and polite interaction, and with most people this mimicry comes off as him being friendly. But when confronted with someone who doesn't return the expected pattern, he's at a loss as to what to do or how to understand what went wrong. In fact, our very first encounter with Reinhard may just be an example where it goes to plan. When he answers Subaru's call for help, he is repeatedly humble, saying he doesn't know how much his modest strength can be to Subaru, and that the thugs fled because it was 2-on-3. He would have been in trouble if he'd been alone. He asks Subaru to dispense with the formal, respectful speech, and then with the use of honorifics, closing the status gap between them. He notes Subaru's appearance and concludes he must be from a foreign land, and so offers him assistance. As Subaru thinks, his nice guy index is off the charts. But he may only have that impression because their interactions followed a pattern Reinhard is familiar with. It works on Subaru, and it works on us, causing the audience to peg Reinhard as this approachable and helpful knight who surely represents the forces of good in this world, an appropriate image for one bearing a title like Sword Saint. We're going to look at one last example. The day after Subaru makes a fool of himself in the royal selection, and then a bigger fool in the duel against Julius. Reinhard shows up at Kruge's manor where Subaru is staying and has come to apologize. Subaru is understandably confused. What does he have to apologize for? As Reinhard sees it, he showed a lack of virtue by failing to stop a disagreement between his two friends. He goes on to say that the duel had no meaning, and at that comment, Subaru narrows his eyes. No meaning? Reinhard seems not to realize how Subaru takes this statement, and thus goes on to point out that Subaru was hurt and Julius tarnished his career. Both of them lost in a sense, and so there was no meaning. Thus he proposes the two of them have a calm, open discussion to try to clear up their misunderstanding, at which point Subaru cuts him off. What is clear in Reinhard's assessment that the duel had no meaning is that he does not understand why either of them took part. Their perspectives are alien to him. So alien that he has shown up to apologize for an encounter where he wasn't even involved. Their behaviors do not compute. It's not a pattern he recognizes, and so, just like with Garfield, Reinhard concludes he's done something wrong, thus defaulting to saying he is sorry. He can't put himself in their point of view to make sense of the duel, and in this conversation, he fails to recognize the emotion he stokes in Subaru when declaring it had no meaning. Even when Subaru cuts him off to say he understands how Reinhard feels, Reinhard doesn't grasp that this is not Subaru agreeing to talking over things with Julius. Subaru ultimately has to be a little abrupt with him, as Reinhard completely misses how much the conversation bothers Subaru, continuing to ask what was gained from the duel or declaring that they've only suffered losses. It's like he sees the duel and sees the facts of the outcome, but is blind to the emotions and motivations that led there and those which have followed after. I saved that scene for last because it is probably the best piece of evidence suggesting Reinhard has very little capacity or experience with either type of empathy, but it also demonstrates how that lack doesn't make him default to being a bad guy. None of his motivations can be ascribed to his duty as a knight or identity as the Sword Saint, as he has come only in the role of friend to them both. And we can't dismiss it as another example of surface-level pleasantries because he argues with Subaru. He doesn't just accept his refusal and bid him a nice day. It's possible that his intentions are good, that he's trying to mend what he sees as harm borne by people he calls friends. But it's also possible that he only senses something is amiss and is casting about for a fix while not understanding any of the underlying causes. Our limited insight into Reinhard infuses even this with uncertainty when it comes to determining his motive. So, what is the verdict? With where we are in the story right now, I think we have a hung jury. It's unclear how many of Reinhard's decisions spring from his sense of duty or identity, and unclear how much agency he even has in that matter. To my eyes, there appears more evidence that he has low empathy, but the few possible exceptions and a general ambiguity keep this from being a sure thing. If I were to apply a different approach, then, I might evaluate Reinhard not as a person on trial, but as a tool of storytelling. And from that perspective, he is a far more interesting character if he's a helpful and powerful nice guy who nevertheless has little understanding of other people. Reinhard has a bit of the Superman problem, of being so powerful that his presence in a story can suck out some of the tension that keeps a narrative engaging. The fight with Theresia is over as soon as he arrives, and so it would have been with many of the conflicts that taxed the other characters to their limits. Keeping him largely off stage has kept the overall story from becoming predictable. But as someone who struggles to comprehend other perspectives, emotions, and values, that tension doesn't go anywhere, because Reinhard is just one complex situation away from becoming an antagonist instead. This also gives him the opportunity for a character arc, a way in which he can grow or regress. Theresia was spared from the path of the sword because she met Wilhelm, and they were able to grow close at first because to him she was just any other girl. Her dying wish is for Reinhard to have encounters in his life with more than just the sword, as she did. And if we extend the parallel, then it means he will likewise need other people to disrupt the obvious path. As of right now, I can think of two possibilities: Felt and Subaru. Felt is linked to him, whether she likes it or not, and already challenges him over his decision-making and lack of sincerity. And for all that she can see his flaws and is annoyed by his hovering presence, she appears to see some promise all the same. In the encounter where Heinkel first shows up, he darkens the mood by bringing up the accusation in the past, and then again when explaining that he will not let Reinhard inherit. But Felt interrupts Reinhard's downcast thoughts and his attempts to offer excuse, telling him to shut up, to just stand there and look proud. She understands what he's feeling and is not indifferent to it. He may be supporting her, but she is investing in him in turn, not as a knight, but as a person. And then there is Subaru, who can take on an aspect of Wilhelm's role for Theresia. He didn't grow up in this world hearing about the legendary Reinhard, wasn't aware of his larger-than-life reputation, and was not immersed in the hierarchical feudal structure that shapes this world. In the same way he is uniquely suited to love Emilia because of no half-elf bias, he is uniquely suited to be a peer to Reinhard because he mostly still sees him as just any other guy. There's a moment during the strategy meeting when they are determining assignments where the two of them are paired. Subaru says that he'll do whatever he can to cover for anything Reinhard is lacking. This rather floors Reinhard a moment, and then he smiles and supposes that it's a trivial matter for Subaru to say such outlandish things. Who else in that room, or any room, would have suggested that Reinhard might have some area where he falls short? That he might have a weakness or a flaw like any normal person? I think Reinhard is a bit touched, And sure enough, he brings this promise up again when they face Regulus, believing that Subaru's words were sincere. And Subaru delivers with Emilia's help, solving the riddle of invincibility that Reinhard's power alone would not have overcome. Last thoughts. I'm not saying Reinhard is an antagonist now, or is guaranteed to become one, and I don't think the missing empathy I've pointed out means he's a bad person or that he is unable to change. But I do think the future possibility of Reinhard as a troublesome person trying to be the hero makes for a far more compelling tale than the one in which he remains an unfailingly friendly, overpowered ally. So while the jury is still undecided on Reinhard, I know which story direction I would rule in favor of. I'm Theta, this is Nearly Unread. Thank you for joining me today. 2 more weeks to go.